Hello everyone, welcome to today's video, which is going to be EMEA Power Rankings. Now, if you saw the Stage 1 video, this is going to be really similar in format, obviously updated with the new top 16 teams. And what we're going to do is we're going to take all 16 of those teams and rank them from worst all the way up to best. And we're not going to look through every single group map and matchup individually, but hopefully by giving you a worst to best, you get a pretty good idea of who I think is going to get out of each respective group. Now, there is one big caveat we should add before we get into this. As was the case in Stage 1, there's going to be a patch partway through this group stage, which means these power rankings might be severely interfered with. So what I'm going to try and do with these power rankings is talk a lot more about the rosters and the general power level, rather than worrying about too many specifics. And we'll maybe talk a little bit about their ability to adapt, because obviously the teams will all have to adapt and learn this new patch, and they'll have pretty limited time. So I think that's going to be a bigger factor than necessary sometimes for raw strength of these rosters. So without too much further ado, let's get into it. As you can see, I've prepared a spreadsheet very similar to last time. We've got the same setup here. We've got the teams all on the left here. Now, currently this is in the order they finished in the Swiss system. So 1st to 16th, top to bottom. We have the rosters for all of the teams. We have tanks in green, DPS in pink and yellow, and of course supports in blue and white. So I think the fairest way to start is to start at the bottom and work our way to the top. That's how people like to do in these lists, all the way up to number 1. So where do we start with at the bottom? Now, it is fair to say, as we get to some of these teams that sort of getting into some of these lower spots of the top 16, I'm a little bit less familiar with the rosters, I got to be honest with you. But I think in EMEA, I've got a better picture. At least I know a few players to pick out from all of them. And honestly, the one that maybe sticks out the least to me is actually this Sheer Cold roster. So the Sheer Cold rebuild, I'm actually going to drop all the way down into 16th position. Not a whole lot of players really outside of Natlocks I'm overly familiar with, so don't have particularly high hopes for them compared to some of the other teams. Now, one of the other teams that actually qualified last time as well in Stage 1 but didn't go that far was Flexo Diax. And I think they're going to be in a similar position. Honestly, I could be wrong about the order of Flex and Sheer Cold here, but I think either way, these teams start to feel towards the bottom. Even though Flexo Diax still have Rod FD, which is FD God's less famous, less popular cousin, I don't think it'll be enough to really take him out in this sort of like bottom couple of spots in the ranking. Now, then we get to a few teams which are quite established teams, I would say, in terms of there's Aoma, who are obviously in Stage 1 as well. They have players that people might recognize, Ollie from the World Cup, Avo as well from the World Cup, Theomatic who's been around contenders. Likewise, some of the players on Meta Boys are actually Team Poland from the World Cup. They might not have the real Jake, but they've got a more budget version. This guy won't cost you $100. This guy will come in, sort you out, $10, cash in hand, no problem. So do have a lot of time for fake Jake, but I think this is where we start to get to the sort of established, but not as talented teams. But before we get to those ones, I think we actually get Smungus. I know a lot of people would believe maybe in the Smungus stream of them shooting up these power rankings, but if we're being honest, I think while their DPS are actually rock solid, I think ML7 is a legitimate flex support, not like a legitimate flex support for a streamer, but an actual legitimate flex support. I think the fact that they're coming in with a little bit of a different approach than a lot of teams, they've not had obviously as much time together. They are just doing it ultimately for the entertainment, as well as, of course, I know they want to win, but there is an element here when I compare it to some of the teams like Meta Boys and Aoma, who have been together a lot longer. I have to look at these teams, and I think actually when it comes down to it, their ability and understanding as a team, especially when we factor in a new patch, might just give them the ability to drop a little bit ahead of them. Now, if I had to put them in order, I would say I'd put Meta Boys here, and then Aoma just above them. I think Aoma has a bit more talent going on the roster, but I think ultimately they're all going to have a pretty tough time getting too far out of groups. Now, once we get to this sort of top 11, if you're the big 11 as everyone's going to obviously start calling it, we actually get a lot of familiar names, and maybe this next one's going to be one of the more controversial ones, but I actually want to put, they're a bit called rock stars here. They were called Umbrella Academy at the time of Swiss Stage, but this is the old Rock Esports roster. So TVNT, Rojo, and Oi, along with Skyle from Left Right Goodnight, and Gucci, who was a Finnish DPS player. So on paper, they should be quite strong, right? They got top 8 last time, so why have I ranked them so low? I mean, obviously losing Checkmate and Izzyaki is going to be a pretty big downgrade. No offense to Skyle and Gucci, though, but you know, I'm pretty sure Gucci hasn't won the Overwatch League yet. So I have to put Checkmate above him for now. I think the big problem for me with Rockstars is I think to be fair, Oi looks like an okay main support and just, you know, does his job. I think Rojo, though, has been the big disappointment here. I think he got a lot of hype coming out. Maybe he was overhyped. Maybe there's an element of that. Too high an expectation for him. But he was really hyped as one of the next big things on the hitscan role. And I don't think he's really achieved that for any of the matches we've seen from Rock Esports. I think the biggest shame about this roster is actually I think TVNT is the real deal. If you were to get me to rank all the tanks in EMEA from best to worst, I think TVNT would actually be pretty high on that list. I think his Sigma is obviously insane. His Orisa actually looks super good. And I think he has like a super high potential. So it's a bit of a shame. I mean, more than a bit of a shame. It's a big shame that he's ended up on a roster that's done so poorly in stage 1. And I think will potentially even do worse in stage 2, honestly. So I think as much as I really like TVNT, I think he's a super talented player. I think, unfortunately, it's not going to be enough. Not going to be enough to push Rockstars very high or even into that top 8 position. As we keep moving up, I think we're going to get to Arya. Obviously, Arya is one of the favorite teams in the competition. The one-trick team, they've got Kaya on Junkrat, they've got Kaiser on Mei. There is a chance that if people are right about this, the Bull becoming meta in this new patch, that maybe Chasm actually really jumps up a little bit here in terms of his value to this roster, and we'll see him play a lot more, even though historically we've seen more Isaac play. So you never know with this team. I think, again, potentially not a good patch for them. I think there's maybe a potential now. With these patches so close, it does favour Arya, because as much as these new patches create chaos and uncertainty for all the other teams, it doesn't really for Arya. They're just going to pick the same. They're still playing Junkrat anyway. They're still going to play Mei anyway. It doesn't shift things as much for them. So maybe there's a bit more stability for them in all of this. But well, I still think they're just going to be outclassed ultimately. I think, especially now, more and more teams are having to face the Arya challenge in both the Swiss stage and in the group stages. Now, what you get is teams get more and more used to dealing with Arya. They have better ideas of what works and what doesn't work. They know now, obviously, Echo is pretty effective into most of the DPS they want to run here. And I think slowly but surely we're going to see Arya sort of struggle in some of these competitions as time goes on, as in theory people get more and more used to playing against them. Now, saying that, you can never rule them out, because Kaya and Kaiser can just make things happen. I think Chasm is actually a good Bull player, so if Bull is strong and this new patch does make him a lot more of a viable option, you never know, their power level could shoot up. And certainly if you look at Group D, that group's probably the most wide open in terms of who could get out of it. So a lot could go their way, but ultimately I don't see them getting out of that group. Now it gets a little bit complicated, because we start to get into a lot of new teams or teams who have had significant changes in the form of like Super Shy, Ataraxia, a Beaks team. Some of these new formed, some of them cores of old rosters. So I think at the bottom of this pile, initially, I actually want to go for Super Shy. I'm going to put him here in 9th place. Obviously, Super Shy are also in the group with SSG and X-Oblivion, so their actual chance of getting out of group are a little bit scuffed anyway because of how tough their group is. And while I do have a lot of time for actually a lot of players on this roster, it doesn't feel like they're quite there right now. I think Rajara is very good. I think we've seen Will play well on Sheer Cold previously. I think when we were watching a lot of the Swiss stage, Zorro was actually doing a lot of the heavy lifting for this team. Looked really good on the Cassidy. I think Takuno and Sobek actually looked like a rock-solid Kiri Lucio backline. Obviously, Takuno was someone we even nearly took to the World Cup in 2023. So actually, I really like loads of pieces of this roster. I think they've got a really bad chance of getting out of groups because they've got a really tough group. And I think ultimately they are still outmatched by a few of these other new teams in terms of raw talent. But I do actually like lots of elements of this roster. And especially if they were in a different group, maybe they could go further. But I honestly hope this core keeps going, because I think there's potential there. And I like a lot of their players, even if this stage maybe isn't the one for them. Now, another team that has sort of come out of nowhere and impressed a lot of people, and maybe this is going to be controversially high for some people, but D'Impero took they full held SSG on Midtown. They got a lot of surprising results. They seem like a very well-coached and well-drilled team. And while obviously 8th place is quite high, I think the group they're in is actually one of the easy ones to get out of, because they're in the Saudi group essentially with Rockstars and Twisted Minds. So Twisted Minds hard to beat, but Rockstars I think are super vulnerable. So D'Impero, I think their chances to make top 8 actually really on. And I also think the impressiveness of how well they've handled and played against these bigger teams is actually a good sign for how they might handle a new patch or all these changes. A well-coached team. Coach OC has been doing a lot of good work both with EMEA and North America. Has a team in both regions. They both qualified for top 16, so not too bad at all. And I think they're actually going to be in a pretty good position to surprise and upset a lot of teams. Now, you can obviously make the argument both ways with a new patch. Now, a new patch favors a team that's well coached and can adapt quickly, but it also creates an element of chaos that maybe actually just shifts it back to raw player strength, which obviously might hurt DiImpero. So you can make the argument both ways. It depends how good a job they do understanding and adapting to the new patch. But honestly, they were super impressive. I hope they do well. And really, teams like DiImpero are the kind of teams we want to see coming up through the system. This is the idea right now. It's not just a lot of the same names. Obviously, you can maybe make the argument that Crocs is certainly a name a lot of people have seen before. But you want to see these new names. You want to see them punch up. You want to see them take rounds and maps off of these top teams. And DiImpero did that in the Swiss stage. And I'm really excited to actually see more of them. Now, we get to... I want to say these next three teams are kind of like in a tier that could go either way. I think the teams I'm talking about are Abiq's team, Ataraxia, and where are they? And Team Peps. So a lot of these teams, obviously Team Peps still have the same core in the form of like Naga, Bembest, and FD-God, and Stelios are still there. But in terms of starting lineup, because Tread actually played most of the games, it's really only Naga and FD-God that remain from the original Peps roster. So actually a pretty significant rebuild in terms of the players we're actually seeing starting most of the time. Likewise, Ataraxia is really the core of Quick Esports, but they've added Gala, they've added MCD, who honestly, I'd be so surprised if we see MCD at any point. I'd be flabbergasted if MCD gets playtime. But he's there, so he makes the list. Erikek, I think, is a tank who has impressed in previous performances, but this is maybe the strongest roster I think we've seen Erikek on before. So I think this is maybe a big tournament for Erikek in terms of, is he the real deal? Can he compete with a lot of these better tanks that we're going to see around him? Especially when we start looking at the teams above him in terms of like the KSAs, for Chase, for Hades, even Dan, who's been around for a lot longer. So I think a big tournament for Erikek. I think on paper, this team is good, right? I think I have loads of time for Gala. If it's still a Kiri meta, and I don't think we've seen anything of a patch notes that suggests it's not going to be a Kiri meta, it's great for Gala. I think Gala's one of the best Kiris. He has crazy aim. I think likewise as well, if Trace is still good and has opportunities for Shaxx and Sauna to be high value. So I think there's lots of reasons this team could be good, but I'm super skeptical. I'm super skeptical that this team, while this team looks good on paper, I'm super skeptical when this team is able to translate it into actual performances. So they're obviously going to be in Group D alongside Abiq's team and alongside Yeah and the Meta Boys. So a really, really competitive group, honestly. There was a bit of heat between Abiq and Ataraxia's team in the round of Swiss. Abiq's team actually came out on top of that one. So my big worry with Ataraxia is that they don't manage to convert all this talent into a cohesive unit, and especially you put a new patch in there. I don't think they adapt quickly enough. I think, especially when we get to the second week of groups when we're on the new patch, I worry Ataraxia could really struggle in that moment there if they still have an important game to play. And I think based on how their group looks, I think they will have an important game to play. So big worries for Ataraxia, actually. And as a result, I'm actually going to put them below Abiq's team, which I'm probably going to get some heat for this. Probably going to get a comment or two from Sauna. But as it stands, that's how I feel. I worry Ataraxia. I think on paper, Ataraxia are the better roster, but I don't think they do it. Meanwhile, Team Abiq have kind of come from nowhere. Not a whole lot of practice, and they've just made it work. And honestly, there's some players like Psycho, Ice, Abiq are probably the standout names on this roster in terms of talent and ability. I think Ice has been a tank who has impressed in a lot of roles previously, but on much smaller teams or in smaller tournaments. Would be excited to see more of him play. I think similarly, Psycho and Abiq are players who have been around for a reasonable amount of time. Excited to see more of. Do I think they actually come close in this new Peps roster? I think they're in the same tier, but I think for now, I'm gonna put them in 6th place. I think obviously 6th place could, because of how their group is, they 6th place for even if they're in 6th place, it could actually still finish top of their group and get a pretty favourable seeding going forward. So things will still work out quite nicely. Similarly for Ataraxia, this is going to be an absolute dogfight between these teams, and super important who gets that top top seeded spot coming out of their group. So a lot of eyes on Group D, especially once we get to the sort of winners matches and the eliminations games. Lots of eyes on that one. Now, this leaves Team Peps, who I think slot in above them into this sort of 5th spot. I think it's worth talking about Peps a little bit because they've made quite significant roster changes, right? We see Tread coming in and Tread actually getting the majority of the playtime, even on things like Winston. We see Zodiel come in as well. And I think Zodiel is a young Spanish hitscan player. I think he's actually super high talent. I really like this signing from Peps. I think he's obviously a very young player. I think especially when I think back to one of the overtimes in Shambali when it was Sheer Cold versus Arya in groups last time, you know, big tense moment. It was not just Shambali, but it was the overtime round of map 5. And Zodiel just got first picks every fight, felt a little bit nervous, something you maybe expect from a young player. So excited to see how he does now on a sort of bigger team, higher expectations. We've seen Team Peps do a pretty good job trying to bring in a lot of young talent in terms of bringing in Stelios for bits of the group stage last time. So actually, this DPS line, I really like it. Really like it. I don't think it touches necessarily the big boys of like, you know, the UB Quartz or the Kevs Kais or the, you know, Psycho Spark Backbone. I don't think it touches those. But I actually really like it. I think it's a really well-rounded DPS trio. I think it covers all the heroes. It opens up all the comps. Really, really, really got a lot of time for that. Then we should talk about Tread. So Tread comes in, obviously fills a lot of gaps in Bembest hero pool in terms of some of the off-tanks. Excited to see more of Tread. I think he's really been, I guess, on the cusp of getting into some of these bigger teams. And in a similar way I was talking about Erikek, this maybe feels like one of the best or strongest rosters he's been on so far, and this is an important tournament for him. I think I actually feel the same about Tread here, where this feels like a pretty as big a shot as he's gotten so far, and I'm really interested to see how Peps perform. They're expected to get out of groups, obviously, so I think being able to see all that is really important for Peps. I expect them to do that, and then how far they can go in the top 8 in the main event, super important as well. We should talk a little bit about the support line, which I am less familiar with, but I think a lot of the things we talked about with Tread apply to level 1 Crook and Yoham as well, especially for level 1 Crook, who I believe is going to be the starting flex support in a lot of these comps. I think we've seen him do okay on some of the Saudi E-League teams and some of the sort of lower contenders teams, so I think he's probably fair to say the best team he's been on so far, and I'm interested to see if he can stack up. I think there's a lot of pressure on all of the 3 new members here. I think Zodiel's clearly the one with the most raw talent, and maybe that's easy to say about hit scans. But I think Tread and level 1 Crook also come in with like a point to prove. This is probably one of the strongest rosters they've come in with. They've got good leadership still in the form of Ben, even if he's not playing, but also Naga in the server who is playing. So I think they've got good leadership behind them, and I'm really interested to see how Team Peps do. Do I think they break above them? The top 3, no. I mean, when I say top 3, I mean, maybe it's obvious, but I'm talking about these 3 teams. Top 3, no. Could they beat Ex-Oblivion? I think it's not out of a question. Really not out of a question. That maybe gives away my next ranking as well, which will, of course, be Ex-Oblivion. Now, Ex-Oblivion have been in a fairly rocky situation as far as what their roster's actually going to be. But they've ultimately settled with everything stayed the same, except they obviously lose Chase, they gain Dan and Tools. And I think I'm saying that right. I'm probably not, but I think I am. The big problem with this roster, or Nice swap, I say this roster, but mainly the tank swap, is they've not just... Ents haven't just gained a good tank player, they've also taken out Ex-Oblivion's sort of best player by quite a large mile. I'm still a big fan. I still think Cookie is one of the best hit scans available in the region. I think Knale is one of the best flex supports available in the region. I think Cloud has actually really surprised me on Tracer in terms of how good he is and how competitive he is with a pretty stacked Tracer region overall. I think Shockwave's been playing well as well. And I think Crispy, again, when you start looking at these main supports, I think, again, you have Astro in a tier of his own. But actually, Crispy is really in this sort of tier with, like, I think Admiral Massa just behind him. Just in the tier below Astro. So I think, on paper, their roster's really competitive. I just worry that Chase was so good. He was kind of a carry for this roster. And now without Chase, they're missing that. I think Dan played well for Team Quick. I think people didn't expect Team Quick to do as well as they did. And obviously, Tools comes in to fill in a lot of those potential gaps in Dan's hero pool. But he's not Chase, I think. And that's not even really much of a criticism, right? I think Chase is one of the best tanks in the region. But it would be hard, almost impossible for Ex-Oblivion to upgrade after losing Chase. So they have downgraded, so they are a bit weaker. So even though they finished 3rd last time, I would be really surprised if Ex Oblivion are able to jump up in its top 3. I think if anything, it's more likely that Ex Oblivion actually find themselves dropping down even further, maybe Peps or something overtake. So it's a bit of a shame because obviously they still have a lot of talented players, and we'll see. Maybe Dan can prove a lot of the haters wrong, but I worry we're going to see a decline in Ex Oblivion. Certainly from how high they achieved last time, but maybe even lower than this 4th place that I'm putting them in now. So bit of a worry for them there. We'll have to see what the new patch brings for them. Now, we enter the big 3. Space Station, ENCE, and Twisted Minds. And there is a big caveat here, obviously, that the new patch is going to come in. I think, to be fair, the order they finished Swiss in, with Space Station in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, is actually really reasonable for current form. And honestly, do I think the new patch shifts this in any particular direction? Well, I think the new patch, if people are worried it's going to be a ball patch or other things like that are going to become available, well, the person with the best ball, I think, out of these 3 teams is SSG. And the person who maybe will do worse or struggle the most against that sort of comp probably is Twisted Minds, historically not the strongest against dive in recent history. So they might drop even lower. So I think actually the patch, based on the information we know, might actually just make the gap between this order a little bit bigger. So I think ultimately I am going to put Twisted Minds in 3rd place. Obviously they have the new signings of the Korean players, but they're not available for this tournament. So it will just be Admiral coming in. I think in terms of Admiral over Kelex in this replacement, I think Admiral is better at Lucio than Kelex in terms of like raw mechanics, his movement, his aim. Admiral, I think, is actually really, really close and probably above any other Lucio whose name isn't Funny Astro in the region when it comes to that side of things. Decision making, and especially ult decision making, can let Admiral down at times. But I think the biggest thing that Twisted Minds are going to struggle with, because I think ultimately Admiral is really good in these brawl roles, in these ground tank roles. He's had so much experience on it. He's had so much success in Overwatch League on these comps. So I think he can play the role. I think he can do the job. The biggest worry for Twisted Minds is how much of the intangibles that Kelex brought to the team, how much of those are going to be missing with Admiral. And I really like Admiral. I think he's a quality teammate. He's a good listener. He's really good at being a role player for a team. But he's not the sort of motivational leader or, I guess, charismatic person in the team that maybe Kelex served as for a long time in a Twisted Minds. So who fills that role for Twisted Minds is a big question. Who fills that role for Twisted Minds is a big question. It won't be Admiral, but can somebody else take the weight? Can somebody else carry that emotional boat, if you will? And I worry the answer is maybe no or not immediately. So I think we're going to see a bit of a fall off from Twisted Minds, especially if dive stays meta. Now, if the patch changes something in a slightly different way and we go to a different comps, the reason I think it might be dive pilled is obviously Bull's getting buffed, so maybe Bull becomes more viable, maybe especially against sort of ground tank or brawl-based comps. But also Venture might potentially come in, and again, Venture feels like it probably suits more towards a divey side of things as well. So maybe there's a couple of indicators we're going to stay in the dive realm, and certainly as we've seen more and more dive being played in a lot of the scrims by Toronto, ENCE, Space Station, it really starts to feel like Space Station and ENCE are actually creeping up the power rankings. And that kind of brings us on to ENCE, obviously, because ENCE have added Chase, and that's a good thing. Chase is one of the best tanks in the region, one of the most flexible tanks in the region. And for ENCE, he opens up the world of dive. He's unlocked the door and they can all come through. Now Kevster can play Tracer with a dive tank. He's got a Winston to play with once again, or a Doomfist to play with once again. And this is a huge power lift, I think, for ENCE. Ultimately, are they better at dive than SSG right now? No. Could they beat him? Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think the biggest gap right now when I look at ENCE v SSG in terms of dive is, especially with Kiri Lucio being meta, is that Landon and Astro are just leagues ahead of all these other Lucio Kiri pairings. I think, especially like, obviously Astro gets a lot of praise because he is the best Lucio in the region. He's probably the best Lucio in the whole Western region. I think you really have to start looking at the elite Korean Lucios to even get people in the same league as Astro, in the likes of Chorong and Chio and all that. But I think actually Landon is really far ahead, especially on Kiri. I think he's got great aim, decision-making good, he's very hard to kill and punish. So I think actually his backline is the biggest difference in dive right now, even though obviously Kev's good, obviously Kai is good. I think also not seen a lot of Ghost so far as well, so if it stays a Kiri meta, which again, is there any indication that Kiri's not going to be meta? Maybe not really. And it was a bit of a problem for Ghost before, which is why Crimson originally came in. Ents have said they want to play more Ghost, so we'll have to see if that actually translates into reality. And also then does that become a little bit of a hindrance for them, at least at first, while they try and upgrade Ghost knowledge and gameplay on heroes that aren't Baptiste. So could be sort of a step forward with Chase and a step back with Ghost if he starts coming in more of a roster. We'll have to wait and see. Obviously, it's still not bad for him. I still think, even though we're talking about these things at Ents, I still think their dive probably sits above every other team whose name isn't SSG. So even though I think they don't reach that height right now, and that is obviously their goal, I think they're not there right now. They're not there right now, but they are still the second best team in the region. And we've seen them beat and take maps off Toronto, who maybe people would assume are a little bit. They feel more like a dive team, essentially, you know, in terms of they have people like someone Sugar Free, Allnat, etc. And maybe a more classic Winston Tracer pairing. But anyway, that brings us on to the top dog. Now, through process of elimination and everything I've said so far, you might have guessed that Space Station are going to be at the top of this list. They 11-0 Swiss, so maybe it's obvious. I think they're in great form. Their scrims look really successful. Dive is a really good matchup for them. If Ball becomes meta, I think Haddy is the best Ball in EMEA, so that's great for him. I think Psycho has been playing unbelievably. I think this signing has actually really completed this roster in a lot of ways. Like in terms of the two players Chris has brought in terms of Astro and Psycho, I think no doubt can be left that this roster has been upgraded quite significantly from the Season 5 and Season 6 London teams, and now it starts to look really complete. Landon and Astro seem to have a really great understanding. They do seem a truly elite level backline. Psycho's having huge impact for the team. Haddy's Winston looks best in the region at the moment. Spark is more than competitive with all the other big hit scans sort of up in his category, you know, in terms of Kai and Quartz. It just looks really good for him. They still have Backbone available if it ever shifts to a different type of meta and maybe Tracer falls out. If they do touch for Tracer a little bit, bring her power level down, I think there's still a lot of good options for her. We even see him bringing back some of the Rhine Classic and making that work. And if one team is pretty good at figuring things out and adapting, I think Space Station have a history of that, at least within the London core. You could make the same argument for, obviously, Goomba from Florida, bringing that to Ents as well. So I think Space Station and Ents are probably actually going to... It might even become a bit more of a top 2 than a big 3. But I think Space Station clearly in number 1 for now. We'll have to wait and see what the patch brings. But right now, I'm actually pretty Space Station pilled. I think they look the best team in the region 100% right now. And I don't think the patch is going to slow them down. If anything, I think the patch might actually even separate them a little bit more from some of their closest competitors. So those are my power rankings. Let me just give it the once over to check I'm actually happy with my own thoughts and my own feelings. Yeah, I think so. I think maybe the Team of Beak one is the one I'm probably most anxious about whether it'll hold true. I feel bad putting Super Shy so low as well because I do like a lot of their players. So I'd like in theory to see Super Shy go a bit higher or crack that top 8, but obviously their group's really tough in the form of EXO and SSG, right? So maybe it's not possible, but maybe in the form of these power rankings, Super Shy could actually jump up, you know? I think the most likely ones to move when I look at it now is like, I think this sort of whole section here, maybe even include Peps in that. I think this whole section is super volatile, right, in terms of which teams could go above or over each other. I think all of these teams could probably beat each other on the day. I think Pep still looks the strongest out of those. But I think especially these, I didn't mean to cross out big, but these 4 could really take series off each other, take maps off each other. I think it could go either way in a lot of those situations. So I think we're going to have a really exciting battle in Group D. We're going to have a really exciting battle, especially when we get to the top 8. Maybe like these sort of teams don't compete with the sort of big boys. But once we get to the lower bracket of the top 8, I think there's some really interesting fixtures in here, some really neck-and-neck ones. I think when I watched the Swiss, a Beaks team versus Ataraxia, the Impero in the mix, all of these seem like really exciting, really competitive, really close games. So I think we could actually be in for a really competitive top 8. There might be a big gap between the top of top 8 and the bottom of top 8, but within their respective sort of groupings and tiers, I think we could see a really, really competitive one. So, locking it in, those are my power rankings. I think what I want to try and do this time is try and do a bit of a recap where after the fact, I maybe come back and look at my power rankings and see if I'm a fraud or an idiot or what I got wrong or what I missed and figure all that out. Obviously, there's a lot to still change with the patch and all of this stuff that's hard to factor in. But let me know what you think of my power rankings. Let me know what your power rankings are. There's always a lot of debate to be had around these things. I'm sure the players might feel quite strongly about some of these rankings as well. But let me know what you think. Let me know if you think I'm a fraud or if I'm spot on with a lot of these. Who do you think is going to be the top team of the region? Will Twisted Minds keep their dominance? Will they fall off as I maybe expect? Will Space Station hold true and actually be able to retain their dominance from Swiss this time around? Lots of questions to ask. I'll be following all the action on my co-stream on Twitch. So I'll put the link up there. Go follow me on there. Come watch all the action with me. I'll be putting the VODs on my second YouTube channel as well of all of that if you miss any of it live. So don't worry your little head about it. There'll be VODs, there'll be coverage. We'll get into all of this. And we'll try and release a bit more analysis content as we go about how these matchups go and why they're being won and lost by each team. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.